Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This has been a whirlwind tour. It's been like 9 or 8 speaking engagements. So this is a quote that from Walter Lippmann from about 100 years ago, but it's a sort of a reminder of the impact of journalism and the media on our lives. It really does create the sense that we have of the world and how people act. And this is kind of what's in people's heads most of the time. Journalism's standard mode of operation, which is to point out the deficiencies, the dysfunctions, the pathologies around the world, because that's how the world will improve, if we are sufficiently aware of the pathologies. But what we find over and over again is that there's a lot missing from journalism. Audiences tell us that, and we can actually see the results in terms of what's happening in politics, or particularly in the Western world. So I started as a journalist in 1992, and I sort of cut my teeth reporting for local news organizations in New York, for New York Newsday. But then I spent really the first major project of my life was writing a book about the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh. How many people have heard of that? Okay, well, it's a bank that pioneered the idea of making loans to women in villages, loans like this woman, whose name is Arashi Balador. And when I went to Bangladesh, I sort of spent a year there, over 2 years, trying to figure out how would you actually create a bank that is capable of working with the poorest people in the world. The Grameen Bank has won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's gone on to sort of launch a kind of a revolution in global development over the past 40 years. But what was fascinating to me was just when I got to Bangladesh, the only image I had of the country beforehand from growing up in Montreal, Canada, was just watching the news and seeing sort of Marines throwing big bags of rice out of the doors of helicopters to sort of pour people in ragtag lungis and saris on the ground who needed to be fed because there had been a cyclone in Bangladesh. And so this was the image that I had of the country. And when I went there, I found that the country was full of competent people and doing a lot of problem solving. And so I got really interested in, like, why doesn't journalism tell more of these kinds of stories? And I spent the next 10 years writing about different interesting things that were happening in the developing world that were reducing poverty or reducing suffering. So just to give you a few examples, this was a story about the first child protection system that came up in India. It was called Childline, and it was actually started by a social worker, and many of the people who became the sort of the quasi-paramedics of this service were actually street kids themselves, who ended up rescuing one another and connecting with NGOs. It was a really creative idea that spread around the country and ended up being adopted by the Indian Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. It was started by a social worker who just couldn't stand to have street kids suffering all the time. I went to South Africa at the height of the AIDS crisis, before there were AIDS antiretroviral medications, and found that even among the poorest communities, that people were creating a kind of improvised system of home care. In many cases, unemployed youth were being trained to be like nurses to take care of people who they didn't have any cures at the time, but they certainly could provide comfort care. And so this is an example of an organization that was started by a nurse with $8,000 of her personal savings to train youth in the stories. And so many stories, how were people bringing solar energy to the 25 million people in Brazil who didn't have electricity? How were people in Hungary reforming the mental health system, where you used to have institutions where they did keep people caged up like this, and transforming them into open institutions where disabled people could dress the way that they wanted, could relax, could go to a discotheque, could work on things based on their interests and skills. And so what I found traveling around the world was that there was this kind of responsive capacity all around the planet, people adapting to new challenges and creating new approaches. And it was really worth people hearing about, because this is really how we solve problems. And what I found is these stories were extremely hard to sell. Editors, would often ask, where's the corruption? Or if the Grameen Bank is stealing the money, that's a story, and so forth. So there was this inherent bias that a story about a problem was a story, but a story about somebody responding to a problem wasn't that important. And so why is that? So let's just like think about this story, right? Remember Ebola? I don't know if you follow this story, but at least the story in the U.S. for about 4 weeks was, should we shut the borders? And essentially, is maybe life on our planet coming to an end? It was such a crisis framing, and the news focused on it every night, and people were scared, and there were a lot of we don't want people coming into the country anymore from different continents and so forth. And what happened was, it stopped, right? Ebola went away, and there was like a couple of articles, maybe, we searched for them, a handful of articles scattered in hundreds of publications that actually explained how it was stopped. Now think about that. Why is it that this is the story when we have a crisis, and turn to page 10, if you can find it, for how we actually stopped Ebola? Why doesn't the public deserve to understand that? Actually, in some cases, and by the way, this is a story of creativity and courage in stopping. That's what it took to stop the people doing very, very creative things in unsafe conditions or in dangerous conditions themselves. So that was the thing that really stuck in my mind about what journalism needs a language to be able to tell these stories in a framework. So now there's a lot of research about what happens if you actually don't tell stories that help people understand how to solve problems. And pretty much this is sort of what I think of as the typical news consumer today, somebody who is overwhelmed by everything that you read, whether it's in your Twitter feed, or on social media, or just the headlines. It's a scary world. And we are continuously, as journalists, in my newspaper, the New York Times, continuously amping up the anxiety that people have, whether it's about North Korea, or whether it's about Syria, or what have you. So the research shows that if people don't have a sense of efficacy, they're more likely to tune out. They're more likely to deny the message. Global warming denial is a really big problem, and it's often triggered to the fact that people actually can't accept such a big problem without having a sense of efficacy around it. So, and then there's research. The Reuters Institute last year did a study, and they looked at people avoiding news, actively avoiding the news now, and they found that 38% of Americans said that they avoid the news. That's a lot of people. And the number 3 reason, the top 3 reasons are because it's depressing, I don't know if I can trust it, and it makes me feel powerless. Okay? And so, in the news business, everyone is trying to sell newspapers now to stay in business, to stay afloat. And so you have a product called news that makes people feel depressed, they don't know if they can trust it, and they feel powerless. And by gosh, they won't even pay for it. It's like it doesn't really make sense when you think about what's the problem. So I had this particular recognition when I was working on this story for the column that I write in the Times. It was a very hard-hitting story about the extent of child trauma in the United States, the number of schools and daycare centers across the country who are beginning to realize just how many of their children, how many of their students have experienced severe childhood adversity to the point where it was very difficult for these kids to regulate themselves enough in a classroom, in a preschool, to learn and to make friends. And so I wanted to write this story, and my editor was concerned that it was a good story, but it was too difficult for people to engage with. So I flipped the narrative, and I began with telling the story of a Head Start program in Missouri that was actually doing some very smart things to help these kids and teaching them and getting very good results with kids who were 4 years old who have had these traumatic issues, but really teaching them how they can handle themselves in the classroom. And it was interesting. The story, it was the #1 most emailed in the Times for a whole week, which is very rare, and it was the top on Facebook. And it really made a light bulb go off for me. It was like, wow, if we tell these stories in a way that people can engage with them, that shows them that there's people trying to do things about these problems, we can probably get people to engage with some of the difficult problems that we want them to be thinking about, rather than avoiding them or tuning out. So that was kind of the genesis of the Solutions Journalism Network, which a bunch of journalists came together. My colleagues Tina Rosenberg at the New York Times and another journalist named Courtney Martin. And we pulled together a group of people and decided to sort of set up this organization, a nonprofit, to try to get news organizations around the country to see that telling stories, rigorous stories about how people are responding to problems is actually something that's legitimate. It's okay for journalists to do this. And we can find a way to do this that's not advocacy, that's not fluff, that's rigorous. And if we actually round out the story, people can engage with the news. And also they'll feel a sense of power and efficacy when they hear about problems, because they'll also be learning about things that people are trying to do to solve them. So we have a solution story tracker. This is a bit out of date. We have 3,200 stories in it of news organizations that are producing solutions journalism, which all of you can go to if you're interested in seeing what's happening. But I wanted to tell a few stories about what news organizations are doing. But first I wanted to talk about what solutions journalism isn't. Because oftentimes when people hear it, they have images in their mind of what they're being asked to do. And those images don't always conform with what they think are legitimate and powerful things that journalists should be doing. So we call these solutions journalism imposters. And at the top of the list is CNN Heroes, which is a Thanksgiving series. And it's basically about sort of the great man or great person theory of history. It's really not a rigorous look at how people are solving problems. It's more of a celebration of kind of, good-heartedness in a way. And it's done at Thanksgiving as a lead into Christmas. So the presenting is that way. There's also stories that come out now and then that dramatically overclaim. Like this one was in the New York Times, that sometimes a soccer ball is more than just a ball. Sometimes it's a lifesaver. No, actually, it's a really great soccer ball because it doesn't break in the developing world if you're poor, but it doesn't save anyone's life. So we see stories like that all the time. We see stories that essentially read like press releases for nonprofits because the journalist has, since they're writing about a response, they don't have to actually be critical. Stories that essentially are advocacy, as if a think tank put them out. This isn't solutions journalism. A common imposter is just the afterthought. We've done 4 days in an investigative series. Now it's Friday. We're going to give you the last 3 inches of 3 bullet points of what you can do about it. You see this in documentaries all the time. It'll be 90 minutes of the problem, and then go to our website if you want to know what to do about it, as if that is much, much less important than the other 90 minutes. You see journalism telling people to go online and click and do this and donate and those sorts of things. That's activism, not journalism. And then you see sort of heartwarming stories of people doing really nice things that are featurey pieces that make for very good clickbait, but are not examples of people rigorously solving problems. This is a nice wheelchair for a disabled pig. It was named Crispy Bacon. So just basically, what solutions journalism is it's just it has some of these sort of basic characteristics. It's a way of telling a story that really focuses on how people are trying to solve a problem, puts the problem solving at the center of the narrative. It looks at the details of implementation. It presents evidence as much as it's available for why you're writing about this response. What results is it actually getting? It focuses on the responses rather than sort of do-gooders or heroes or charismatic visionaries. So we're really looking at what's happening here, not the greatness or the kindness of the people involved. The characters are important. And it really includes the limitations. It looks at every response has limitations. It may be too expensive. It may be not politically viable. The data may not be very good at this point. So there's always caveats around any response. There's nothing that's perfect. And just to give a good example of how this solutions journalism can be used around a major sort of investigative story, and we're finding more and more that this is in fact how it's being used. People thought originally it was sort of good news, but in fact it's being used more and more as an accountability tool, which is quite interesting to us. So this is based on this story that was done, a series that the Cleveland Plain Dealer did a number of years ago, looking at the problem of lead paint in different parts of the inner city part of Cleveland. This map shows that in some areas of Cleveland, close to 50% of the children in those red zones are exposed or were exposed to lead paint. So lead paint is a neurotoxin. It's sort of a public health nightmare. The plain dealer had done 2 watchdog series on this problem previously in the decade, and there hadn't been much change that had happened. So when they came to us, we were basically saying, well, okay, why didn't the previous series lead to any change? And so we asked the journalists, and Bree Zeltner, who was one of the journalists who worked on this series, basically said that we needed to take away the local excuses of officials. They said, we don't have the money, we don't have the staff. They were always hiding behind excuses. And so we thought, okay, so how do you create a journalism series that doesn't feed the apathy or the fatalism, but actually activates people? And so what the plain dealer did is they looked for other series. They looked at other cities that had also had a problem with lead paint, and they looked at how they had responded differently than Cleveland had. And they found other places had lower levels, and they were doing common sense things that Cleveland had never done. So this is the kind of story they started to write, this one, which is we call it a sort of a how done it. They looked, remember, this is the Cleveland plain dealer going to Rochester and figuring out how Rochester brought down its lead paint exposures over a 10-year period. And they sort of deconstructed what Rochester had done. And then they started doing really nerdy things like this, like they went to a whole bunch of cities and they broke down all the strategies that they can find in other cities. And they basically said what Cleveland does and what smart cities do, what Cleveland does and what smart cities do. So you can imagine, the kind of pressure that this puts on. It puts pressure on local officials, but it's not the pressure that makes people feel fatalistic or dejected. It's the pressure that makes people feel sort of like energetically angry, but angry with a purpose, And it had an effect, So because it was very clear that better performance was possible, pressure on the local administration really made a difference this time. And so people were fired or had to resign. The city actually staffed up to do the kinds of inspections that other cities had done. They passed new laws requiring different kinds of inspections. The state got involved, and they started posting things. These were all solutions or pieces of the puzzle of solving this problem that had been covered in the series. And so in the end, what you ended up having was a problem that for many people had thought was unavoidable. The paper was able to show is unacceptable. And so this is a really powerful thing. They were essentially using journalism to set the expectations in the city at a higher level, which creates more pressure. And then since this series has come up, they've continued to maintain the pressure. It's been 2 years now, and they continue to, are we still doing inspections? Are we doing them fast enough? So they've gone back to the traditional watchdog role to keep the pressure on, but it's a healthy pressure. It's a pressure that leads to change. And so, and we have found that that in this approach, when we're talking to editors, this is a really useful set of questions to ask people about when should you use a solutions journalism approach versus a traditional investigative or just a traditional reporting approach. So basically, at the beginning, you're asking the question, what's missing? Is there a lack of awareness about the problem? Do people understand it? Do they understand how urgent it is? If there isn't a lack of awareness, so if people already know the problem exists, then the next question is, do people understand what their responses are, what their options are essentially, as a community or as individuals? And if people don't know what their options are, then you come in and you say, okay, we really need to put the options on the table. We need to have help people have a better sense of where the power is against this problem. And that's a sort of pretty much the frame that many newsrooms have gone through. And I'll show an example. You'll see the pattern. I'll give another example here of how the Seattle Times used the same approach when it was dealing with school suspensions at the elementary school level. And they found that they were very racially skewed. They were pretty much 5-to-1 black children being suspended at the rate of white children. In many cases for very minor infractions, not even an infraction, just sort of 7-year-old kid being disobedient kind of infractions. And in fact, these were suspensions that began often in grade 2. So crazy stuff. So they did a big story, a great investigation showing how the suspensions were skewed along racial lines. And they had all the data. And this kind of hit the city like a lead pipe. And one of the anticipated effects was that the school board, banned suspensions at the elementary school level. So that was a good policy change. But then you have the teachers coming and saying, wow, we didn't realize, first of all, that this was a problem. We didn't realize how bad it was. Thank you for letting us know. Now we can't suspend kids anymore, which is good. But the behavior problems are still there. They didn't just go away. So what do we do? So the paper said, OK, well, let's look at what are different ways that schools are dealing with behavior that are not suspending 7-year-olds. And it turned out that there were a lot of examples of models around an approach that's sort of lumped into a category called restorative justice, where you actually teach kids how to understand their behavior, how to understand the culture, essentially how to be moral actors. And when done well, it can be really effective and actually quite inspiring. And the paper did a whole bunch of stories on restorative justice. They found places where it wasn't working because it wasn't implemented well, and they found places where it was implemented very faithfully, and they were seeing real differences in the kids' behavior and in the culture of the school. And so, and then they peeled the onion even further, and they found that when you really look at the roots of suspensions, you really have to go into the household environment and the kind of adverse childhood experiences or trauma that the children were exposed to. So they started going deeper. They started with, the watchdog against suspensions, and then helping to see what schools were doing, and then actually looking at the home environment and seeing what's happening before the kids even get to the school. So you can see when you adopt this sort of solutions frame, you start trying to go deeper and deeper into what really are the ultimate causes of the problem, and how can we report and shed more light on other ways of addressing the problem. Kathy Best, the former editor at the Seattle Times, just told us, and we've heard this over and over, that these series get people talking about these issues in a completely different way, because it's not journalism as usual. It's really helping people see things and also recognizing that there are people in their own community who are trying to solve these problems. There are good faith actors that are also part of the narrative, which is something that we don't often find in journalism. They also found that when they started surveying their readers about what they thought about the Education Lab, which is their solutions-oriented series, that people said very often that the stories changed the way they think about the issue, that they believe that there are ways to solve problems, and that educators in particular and parents often shared these stories with each other, saying, hey, by the way, you should read this, just the way we would share tips with friends about things that could be helpful to them. They found that when they brought the community around to have discussions about education, the conversations were informed by what should we do? How can we solve this problem better? What do we think about some of the ideas that have been put on the table? And this is very different from how did we get here and who's to blame, which is the typical conversation that journalism invites people to get involved in. This conversation is more like, what should we be doing to further improve the outcomes of kids in elementary school? So it's a different framing of the questions. And then finally, they found that in Education Lab, and this is a study that was done by a survey that was done by the American Press Institute, that these stories got longer time on page, got more page views, got much higher shares as well. So this idea that bad news sells better, and clickbait needs to be all about sort of getting the adrenaline flowing. Maybe that's not true. Maybe that's an assumption that we should revisit. So I want to leave a half an hour for questions. So I'm going to skip over. Well, this project, the Poverty Puzzle, was done by the Chattanooga Times Free Press, and what they did was they looked at many different ways that people were trying to reduce poverty in Chattanooga, through the school system, through job training, by dealing with families, by trying to rewire the community in ways that people were building social capital. And they found that, not surprisingly, there's no solution to poverty. They basically found there's no solution to poverty, but they found that there's a lot of people working on pieces of the puzzle that if you put them together, you could begin to see how some of these things could crystallized together, and the city could slowly move and mitigate more and more poverty. That was basically the story. Like, it's kind of like we're still in the tunnel, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. That's what you can draw from this series. It's not by any means Pollyannish. It's actually very sobering, but it was kind of amazing. I mean, the fact it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, which was great, and the reporters were really excited. But they found that at the community level, people just started talking about poverty in Chattanooga in a different way. The United Way gave them an award, which was, and they hosted a conference on economic mobility and later gave the newspaper an award. The mayor brought it into his platform. It changed the way the city council members, changed people who got elected. It led local business leaders and local foundations to start investing in some of the ideas that were sort of embedded in the story, and the reporter who was behind this spent a whole year on this. Basically said, in addition to really being excited about the United Way honor and saying it was for us it was more prestigious than getting a finalist for the Pulitzer, because it meant that the community really valued this as a contribution to our well-being. But she talked about being stopped by people in the streets and thanking her for writing the series, and in the end she said we couldn't believe that the Facebook comments were so civil. This is a big thing in the United States today, to have civil constructive dialogue. So I'm going to give one other very quick example of something that was kind of a small news organization in central Ohio that has one of the highest, the county has one of the highest infant mortality rates, decided to do a solution series. They focused on this problem. They did a big, they reported on the extent of the problem and the severity of the problem, but they also started looking at what people could do about it. And so they looked at the baby box and a whole bunch of different models of things that were potential solutions to keep children safer. And in the end, after they had done reporting on a bunch of different ideas, they weren't satisfied to just put it in the paper. They decided that as a news organization, to be fully responsible to the community, they had to host a baby shower, because it wasn't enough to assume that people would read these stories. They wanted to make sure that parents in the community really got the information they needed to have healthy children. And they had lines around the block for this. I mean, they literally had hundreds of people come into the baby shower, very unexpected. The investigative journalist who worked on this project was not, at first, she was sort of like, a baby shower? I did not sign up as a journalist to host baby showers. But her publisher really wanted to do it. And afterwards, she was kind of thrilled that she said, wow, I realize that my job is not just to put lines of words together. My job is to communicate information to the people in this community that will help us all build a better community. And does it matter if it's lines on the paper or conversations face-to-face over a table in the newsroom? So it's quite interesting, and they were pretty thrilled. This news organization has a very small staff. It's a tiny digital news organization in central Ohio called the Richland Source that is doing great work, and they're starting to get noticed. Like Pointer actually said, "Wow, this is pretty cool. Who knew of a news organization? Who thought of this?" But this is part of sort of the creative engagement that we see people doing now. Once the community hears about interesting ideas and models and options to address problems, people naturally want to talk about them. And they want to talk about them in a constructive, less polarized way than they want to talk about how you voted or what's your position on tax cuts or so forth. It's a different kind of conversation. So in sum, what we have found, our network has now worked with 150 news organizations. We've directly done workshops with 4,000 journalists. And we've engaged with another 7,000 journalists through online tools and resources that we have on our website. We actually have sort of toolkits and things that are in 7 languages now, because and it's all been requested by people in China, people in Russia, people in the Arab world. It's in Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesian, because this has all been based on demand from people in other countries, journalists in other countries. So it's kind of interesting how this frame is spreading. I mean, we've never been to Indonesia to talk about this idea, but the felt need around the world that as journalists we could be doing more for people than telling them what blew up today is very strong. I'm going to skip on that. I'm going to just go to the last. So these are the three most common questions that come up when we talk about solutions journalism. Isn't just choosing a story advocacy. If you choose to write about this school or this hospital or this policy or program, aren't you essentially advocating for that particular approach? That comes up all the time. And it's one of the number one things that journalists are afraid of being accused of if they practice journalism this way. So these are sort of our main responses to that. You know, it's not advocacy if you don't overclaim. If you just say, this is the response and this is the results that it's getting, and tomorrow we'll look at something different. And if you show that there are other ways, there's no one right way or this is the right way, you're not saying this is the way to solve a problem. You're saying this is an illustration of how different people are responding to the problem. And once again, you can write these stories so that it's not like about this is a great nonprofit or this organization or this hospital is doing a great thing. You're essentially writing about the insights. How are people actually solving the problem? So it's not so much about celebrating heroes or charismatic leaders. It's really about describing the process by which people solve problems and the insights you can get from it. And finally, it's not advocacy if you really show that there are limitations and problems with every potential solution as well. So there's no easy fixes. How do I find the best solution? If I'm going to write about a school, you know, how to bring down the dropout rate or something, I need to find the best model in the United States. Well, that's crazy. There is no best model. Like I say, every approach to a problem has caveats and different limitations. So you can't. You can only find stories that illustrate different approaches to problems. And you can always draw out what's innovative or interesting in that model and also what's problematic about that model. And there's always an opportunity to learn. If they're getting good results, there's something that's happening there that we can open the hood up and look under it and see what's going on. And finally, how much evidence do I need for a story? If I'm going to write about a response, and the answer to that really is you need enough evidence to satisfy yourself and your editor that this is worth talking about. Because, you know, for some stories at an early stage, you're only going to have anecdotal evidence of the nurses say this is working better, or the teachers say this is working better, or the parents love it. You're not going to have data. But in time, you can tell your readers, you know, we thought that this was really interesting to write about effectively in your story, and we're going to come back when we know more. Because the chances are a year later, you might find out everybody was excited about it, but it didn't work out the way people thought, which is par for the course. In many ideas start out with high expectations, but they discover that their assumptions were wrong. And that's a perfectly good story to write and then come back to. So journalists are not supposed to talk about hope. Our job is not to make people hopeful. But we thought that is there a rigorous definition of hope that actually holds up to the standards of journalism? So we found this quote from Maimonides, and it really struck me that it fits, that it's a belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. So, you know, if you're writing about climate change or global warming today, the probability is that there's going to be some really bad things that happen that are pretty much unavoidable because we're not responding quick enough to mitigate climate change. But on the other hand, you know, there are so many things that are possible that are at earlier stages, that are scaling, that are happening that if we don't write about them, if we don't cover them and make people realize that these are plausible possibilities, they're never going to happen. So in some ways, journalism not covering them actually becomes self-fulfilling, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we can actually make the growth of solutions or the exploration of solutions can be part of you know, what we do every day. And you know, I guess the last thing, and this I've had this in my own life. Joan, who wrote that series, McGarrett McClune at the Chattanooga Times Free Press, the last installment of her series on the poverty puzzle was a very long essay about how writing that series had changed her life and had actually pulled her out of a depression after a death in her family. And there's something very personal to this story too. As journalists, we expose ourselves to some of the worst things in the world. That's what we've signed up for. And there's a lot of secondary trauma that journalists experience, especially if they cover a lot of violence and stuff like that. But it's important to know that the other half of the story is just as real. People are responding to these problems, and to make that part of what you do and part of your life is also something that is important for all of us at a sort of a level of personal well-being.